On August 14, 1765, past midnight in the dark cobblestone alleys of Boston, if you were a British official walking those streets, you did not fear the shadows themselves. You feared what was waiting inside them. High up in the branches of a massive ancient elm tree, a straw dummy swung in the cold sea breeze, illuminated only by flickering lantern light. It bore the name of Andrew Oliver, the king's newly appointed stamp collector. But hanging him in effigy was only the beginning. By nightfall, a mob of 2,000 men descended upon Oliver's mansion, chopping down his doors, drinking his wine cellar dry, and dragging his furniture into the street to burn. When they caught up with those who enforced the king's taxes, they brought out a bucket of boiling black pine pitch, poured it directly onto bare human skin, and covered the victims in feathers. It was a brutal, agonizing punishment, designed to inflict permanent physical scarring and public humiliation. The British government called them a bloodthirsty cartel and radical terrorists. History books would later call them patriots. This was not a spontaneous riot by an angry crowd. It was a calculated, masterfully orchestrated campaign of political terror, executed by an underground shadow network operating from tavern basements. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Long before George Washington ever commanded an army, and long before Thomas Jefferson wrote a single word of the Declaration of Independence, this secret society had already decided to tear down the British Empire in America. To understand how a handful of rebellious colonists managed to defeat the most powerful empire on earth, you have to throw away the sanitized paintings in history textbooks. The American Revolution did not begin with polished gentlemen exchanging polite philosophical debates in pristine halls. It began in the smelly, smoke-filled basement of a Boston distillery. In 1763, Great Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War against France, but the victory left the British crown buried under an astronomical national debt. To pay for the war, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765. For the first time, London placed a direct tax on virtually every piece of printed paper in the American colonies, including legal contracts, wills, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and even dice. To ordinary colonists, this was not simply an inconvenient expense, it was an existential threat. If Parliament could tax their daily paper without giving them representation in London, nothing would prevent the king from seizing their land, their businesses, or their personal property whenever the crown needed money. While wealthy colonial politicians wrote mild petitions to King George III, 9 ordinary men met secretly in Chase and Speakman's distillery in Boston's South End. They called themselves the Loyal Nine. They were not famous statesmen. They were working-class men and merchants, including a brass founder, a printer, 2 distillers, a painter, a jeweler, and a leather dresser. They realized that polite letters would never stop Parliament, but fear and economic disruption would. They needed an armed force that could control the streets, so they turned to the one man in Boston who knew how to command a crowd, Ebenezer Mackintosh. Mackintosh was a shoemaker, a French and Indian War veteran, and the leader of the South End street gang. Every year on November 5th, Boston was torn apart by violent gang wars between rival street factions from the North End and South End. The Loyal Nine brokered a peace treaty between the gangs, united them under Mackintosh's leadership, and channeled their violent energy away from each other and directly toward British royal officials.
The Loyal Nine expanded their secret network across Boston and adopted a new name, taking inspiration from a speech delivered in Parliament by an English politician named Isaac Barré, who had praised the colonists as Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty operated with terrifying efficiency. On August 26, 1765, Mackintosh led a massive crowd to the grand mansion of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, the most powerful royal official in Massachusetts. The mob surrounded the house, smashed through the heavy oak doors with axes, and stripped the home completely bare. They threw priceless historical documents into the street, destroyed his art collection, cut down his formal gardens, and ripped the roof off the building. Hutchinson later wrote that he stood in the street with nothing left in the world but the clothes on his back. The terror campaign achieved its immediate goal. Within weeks of the riots, every single stamp distributor across the 13 colonies resigned in fear for their lives. Ships carrying the official tax paper arrived in American harbors, but no royal official dared to unload or distribute them. With trade crippled and tax collection impossible, British merchants in London pressured Parliament to repeal the law. In 1766, Parliament backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. The colonies erupted in celebration, lighting bonfires and drinking in the streets. But the Sons of Liberty knew that Parliament had not surrendered its ambition to control America. The Sons of Liberty did not disband. Instead, they built an underground communications network that stretched from Massachusetts to South Carolina, preparing for the next conflict. The heart of the Sons of Liberty in Boston was the Green Dragon Tavern, a dark brick building on Union Street that Loyalists referred to as the headquarters of the Revolution. In the tavern's private basement rooms, lit by flickering tallow candles and filled with the smell of tobacco and rum punch, the leadership met to plan their moves. The political brain of the operation belonged to Samuel Adams. Adams was a failed businessman and a terrible tax collector, but he possessed an extraordinary genius for political propaganda and organizational strategy. Adams realized that to defeat an empire, the colonies had to act as a unified nation rather than 13 separate territories. He established the Committees of Correspondence, a covert network of letter writers and couriers that allowed secret Sons of Liberty chapters to share intelligence, coordinate boycotts, and spread news within hours. Working alongside Adams was Paul Revere, a skilled silversmith, master engraver, and trusted courier. Revere was a member of multiple secret fraternities in Boston, including the Freemasons and the North End Caucus, making him the vital bridge connecting wealthy merchants, artisans, and street laborers. Revere created striking political engravings that were printed in news sheets and distributed throughout the colonies. Members of the inner circle wore hidden brass medals underneath their coats, depicting an oak tree and a sword, and they identified each other using secret handshakes and passwords. If you were a British loyalist living in Boston, you felt the constant, invisible presence of a shadow government that policed your daily actions, monitored your business transactions, and threatened your survival if you stepped out of line. When Parliament passed the Townshend Acts in 1767, placing new taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, the Sons of Liberty launched an aggressive non-importation campaign. They forced local merchants to sign agreements promising not to buy or sell any British goods. If a merchant refused to sign, the Sons of Liberty published his name in the local newspaper, marked his shop front with smeared charcoal and offal, and stationed armed men outside his doors to intimidate customers. In some cases, recalcitrant shopkeepers had their homes smeared with night soil or found their delivery wagons overturned and burned. Through relentless social shaming and physical intimidation, the secret society effectively cut off British imports, causing massive financial losses for London merchants and proving that colonial economic defiance could cripple British trade. By 1768, King George III decided to restore order by force, sending 4 military regiments consisting of over 2,000 armed British redcoats to occupy Boston. A city of 16,000 residents was suddenly placed under military occupation. Tensions between the local citizens and the occupying army grew more hostile every day. British soldiers competed with local dock workers for part-time jobs, enforced curfew laws, and stood guard on street corners with loaded muskets. Samuel Adams used his network of writers to publish inflammatory newspaper articles detailing real and fabricated atrocities committed by redcoats, keeping the population at a constant state of fury.
The inevitable explosion occurred on the freezing night of March 5, 1770. Outside the Custom House on King Street, a lone British sentry got into a heated verbal argument with a young wigmaker's apprentice. The sentry struck the boy with the butt of his musket. An angry mob gathered quickly, throwing snowballs, chunks of ice, coal, and oyster shells at the guard. Captain Thomas Preston led 7 British soldiers to reinforce the sentry, forming a defensive arc with fixed bayonets. The crowd pressed closer, shouting curses and daring the soldiers to fire. In the chaos, a soldier was struck by a club, slipped on the ice, and accidentally fired his musket into the air. Hearing the shot, the panicking redcoats fired a volley directly into the unarmed crowd. When the gun smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying on the blood-stained snow, including Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and Native American descent. Historically, the incident was a chaotic street brawl that spiraled out of control, but Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty instantly transformed the tragic event into a powerful weapon of war. Within 48 hours, Paul Revere produced a famous copperplate engraving titled The Bloody Massacre. The artwork depicted British soldiers standing in a neat, organized line, smiling as their captain gave a formal order to fire on peaceful, innocent citizens. It was a masterclass in political propaganda. Thousands of prints were rushed across the Atlantic and distributed throughout the 13 colonies. The image convinced millions of Americans that the British Army was not there to protect them, but to murder them. The tension reached a historical climax in late 1773 over the shipment of tea. Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting a complete monopoly on the American tea trade to the struggling British East India Company. The law allowed the company to sell tea directly to America at undercut prices, while still collecting a small parliamentary tax. London believed the colonists would accept the tax if the tea was cheap. They misunderstood the Sons of Liberty entirely. To the secret society, accepting the cheap tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them without representation. When 3 British East India Company ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor loaded with 92,000 pounds of tea, the Sons of Liberty blocked the cargo from being unloaded. On December 16, 1773, over 5,000 people packed into the Old South Meeting House to hear Samuel Adams address the crisis.
The royal governor refused to allow the ships to leave the harbor without paying the duties. As night fell, Samuel Adams stood up at the pulpit and uttered the prearranged signal code that this meeting could do nothing more to save the country. Immediately, war whoops resonated from the back of the church and out into the street. Over 100 men marched toward Griffin's Wharf. To disguise their identities and prevent criminal prosecution, they smudged their faces with soot and coal dust, wrapped themselves in blankets, and dressed as Mohawk warriors. The men boarded the 3 ships in total silence. They divided into 3 teams, systematically hauled 342 heavy wooden chests of tea up from the holds, smashed them open with hatchets, and dumped the contents into the harbor waters. They worked for 3 hours without stealing a single item or damaging the ships themselves. When a padlock belonging to one of the captains was broken, the Sons of Liberty returned the next day with a replacement. Over 46 tons of tea, worth over $2 million in modern currency, floated on the tide. By midnight, the harbor was black with tea, and the men swept the decks clean, took off their boots to shake out any remaining leaves, and dispersed back into the dark alleys of Boston. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, King George III and Parliament decided that diplomacy was over. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which Americans called the Intolerable Acts. London closed Boston Harbor completely, halting all merchant trade and starving the city's economy. They abolished local self-government in Massachusetts, appointed General Thomas Gage as military governor, and passed a new Quartering Act, allowing soldiers to be housed in private buildings. London expected these brutal measures to isolate Massachusetts and terrify the other colonies into submission. Instead, it triggered the exact opposite reaction. The Sons of Liberty's intercolonial communications network mobilized instantly. Secret chapters across the continent organized relief efforts. Cartloads of food, livestock, grain, and money poured into Boston from Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. The secret society was no longer just organizing street protests or tarring tax collectors. They began building an actual army. They formed local militias, established secret stashes of arms and gunpowder in rural towns, and recruited fast horseback riders to monitor British troop movements. On the night of April 18, 1775, General Gage ordered 700 British redcoats to march out of Boston toward the town of Concord to seize a massive illegal stockpile of weapons belonging to the Sons of Liberty. But the Shadow Network was watching. Paul Revere and William Dawes slipped out of Boston on horseback to spread the alarm through the countryside. When the British troops arrived at Lexington Green at sunrise on April 19th, 77 armed colonial militiamen were waiting for them. An unknown person fired a shot, leading to a bloody firefight that left 8 colonists dead. As the redcoats marched on to Concord, thousands of colonial militiamen ambushed them from behind trees, stone walls, and farmhouses, forcing the British Army into a disastrous retreat back to Boston. The covert war in the shadows had officially erupted into the American Revolutionary War. The Sons of Liberty remain one of the most complex and controversial groups in North American history. To the traditional American narrative, they were heroic freedom fighters who risked their lives and property to resist imperial tyranny and lay the groundwork for modern democracy. To British authorities and royalist colonists, they were an unlawful, violent mob that used intimidation, property destruction, torture, and censorship to suppress political opposition and tear down law and order. The Sons of Liberty forced strict obedience to their boycotts, destroyed the livelihoods of political opponents, and created an atmosphere of fear where speaking out in favor of the crown could result in physical violence or exile. Yet without their ruthless organization, strategic propaganda, and willingness to use direct action, the American Revolution might never have gained the momentum necessary to defeat the British Empire. They proved that independence was forged not exclusively through intellectual debates among elites, but through uncompromising street-level resistance, organized by blacksmiths, printers, tavern owners, and dock workers. When John Adams reflected on the Revolution decades later, he wrote that the Revolution was effected before the war commenced because the Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. It was the Sons of Liberty who planted it there. Today, the original Liberty Tree in Boston is gone, cut down by British troops for firewood in 1775, and the Green Dragon Tavern was demolished in the 19th century. But the blueprint created by those 9 men in a Boston distillery lives on in the DNA of American political defiance, proving that a handful of committed individuals operating in the shadows can change the course of human history.